Sail Away Stories presents The Incredible Toad of Toad Hall, Part 4. The rat put out a neat little brown paw, gripped Toad firmly by the scruff of the neck, and gave a great hoist and a pull, and the waterlogged Toad came up slowly but surely over the edge of the hole, till at last he stood safe and sound in the hall, streaked with mud and weed, to be sure, and with the water streaming off him, but happy and high-spirited as of old, now that he found himself once more in the house of a friend, and dodging and evasions were over, and he could lay aside a disguise that was so unworthy of his position and wanted such a lot of living up to.
"Oh, Ratty! Oh, Ratty! I've been through such times since I saw you last you can't think. Such trials, such sufferings, all so nobly borne. And such escapes, such disguises, such subterfuges, all so cleverly planned out. Just hold on and I'll tell you everything."
Toad, you go off upstairs at once, and take off that old cotton rag that looked as if it might formerly have belonged to some washerwoman, and clean yourself thoroughly, and put on some of my clothes, and try and come down looking like a gentleman if you can. For a more shabby, bedraggled, disrespectable-looking object than you are, I never set eyes on in my whole life. Now, stop swaggering and arguing, and be off. I'll have something to say to you later.
By the time he came down again, luncheon was on the table, and very glad Toad was to see it. While they ate, Toad told the rat all his adventures, dwelling chiefly on his own cleverness, and presence of mind in emergencies, and cunning in tight places, and rather making out that he had been having a gay and highly colored experience. But the more he talked and boasted, the more grave and silent the rat became.
"Well, I can't tell you how appreciative I am of you, my dear Ratty. I'm going to stroll quietly down to Toad Hall and get into clothes of my own, and set things going again on the old lines. I've had enough adventures. I shall lead a quiet, steady, respectable life, pottering about on my property and improving it. Perhaps I'll do a bit of landscaping. There will always be a bit of dinner for my friends when they come to see me, and I shall keep a pony chaise to jog about in the country in, just as I used to in the good old days before I got restless and wanted to do things."
Stroll quietly down to Toad Hall? What are you talking about? Do you mean to say you haven't heard?
"Heard what? What haven't I heard?"
Do you mean to tell me that you've heard nothing about the Stouts and the Weasels?
"What? The Wildwooders? No, not a word. What have they been doing?"
They have taken Toad Hall.
"Go on, Ratty. Tell me all. The worst is over. I am an animal again. I can bear it."
When you got into that trouble of yours, I mean when you disappeared from society for a time over that misunderstanding about a machine, you know. Well, it was a good deal talked about down here, naturally. Not only along the riverside, but even in the wild wood. Animals took sides, as always happens. The river bankers stuck up for you and said you had been infamously treated, and there was no justice to be had in the land nowadays. But the wild wood animals said hard things and served you right, and it was time this sort of thing was stopped. And they got very cocky and went about saying you were done for this time. You would never come back again. Never, never. That's the sort of little beasts they are. But Mole and Badger, they stuck out through thick and thin that you would come back again soon somehow. They didn't know exactly how, but somehow.
Toad began to sit up in his chair again and to smirk a little.
Badger and I were sitting by the fire in the smoking room, telling stories and suspecting nothing, for it wasn't a night for any animals to be out in, when those bloodthirsty villains broke down the doors and rushed in upon us from every side. We made the best fight we could, but what was the good? We were unarmed and taken by surprise, and what can two animals do against hundreds?
Here the unfeeling Toad broke into a snigger, and then pulled himself together and tried to look particularly solemn.
And the Wild Wooders have been living in Toad Hall ever since, and going on simply anyhow. Lying in bed half the day and breakfast at all hours, and the place in such a mess, I'm told, it's not fit to be seen. Eating your grub and drinking your drink, and making bad jokes about you, and singing vulgar songs about prisons and magistrates and policemen. Horrid personal songs with no humour in them. And they're telling the tradespeople and everybody that they've come to stay for good.
No, they have. And I shall jolly soon see about that.
The position's as bad as it can be, and as for what's to be done, why, blessed if I know. The Badger and I have been round and round the place, by night and by day. Always the same thing. Sentries posted everywhere. Guns poked out at us, stones thrown at us. Always an animal on the lookout, and when they see us, my, how they do laugh. That's what annoys me most.
It's a very difficult situation, but I think I see now, in the depths of my mind, what Toad really ought to do. I will tell you. He ought to...
Be quiet at once, all of you.
Instantly, everyone was silent. It was the Badger who emerged from the doorway. When he saw that he had secured their attention and that they were evidently waiting for him to address them, he turned back to the table and reached out for the cheese. And so great was the respect commanded by the solid qualities of that admirable animal that not another word was uttered until he had quite finished his repast and brushed the crumbs from his knees. The Toad fidgeted a good deal, but the Rat held him firmly down. At last he spoke.
Toad, you bad, troublesome little animal. Aren't you ashamed of yourself? What do you think your father, my old friend, would have said if he had been here tonight and known of all your goings-on?
Toad, who was on the sofa by this time with his legs up, rolled over on his face, shaken by sobs of contrition.
There. We're going to let bygones be bygones. But what the mole says is quite true. The stouts are on guard at every point, and they make the best sentinels in the world. It's quite useless to think of attacking the place, and they're too strong for us.
Then it's all over. I shall go and enlist for a soldier, and never see my dear Toad Hall any more.
There are more ways of getting back a place than taking it by storm. I haven't said my last word yet. Now, I'm going to tell you a great secret.
Toad sat up slowly and dried his eyes. Secrets had an immense attraction for him, because he could never keep one, and he enjoyed the sort of unhallowed thrill he experienced when he went and told another animal, after having faithfully promised not to.
There is an underground passage that leads from the riverbank, quite near here, right up into the middle of Toad Hall.
Oh, nonsense, Badger. You've been listening to the yarns they spin in the public houses about here. I know every inch of Toad Hall inside and out. Nothing of the sort, I do assure you.
My young friend, your father, who was a worthy animal, a lot worthier than some other animals I know, was a particular friend of mine, and told me a great deal he wouldn't have dreamt of telling you. He discovered that passage. He didn't make it, of course. That was done hundreds of years before he ever came to live there. And he repaired it and cleaned it out because he thought it might come in useful someday, in case of some trouble or danger. And he showed it to me. Don't let my son know about it, he said to me. He's a good boy, but very light and volatile in character, and simply cannot hold his tongue. If he's ever in a real fix, and it would be of use to him, you may tell him about the secret passage, but not before.
The other animals looked hard at Toad to see how he would take it. Toad was inclined to be sulky at first, but he brightened up immediately, like the good fellow he was.
I've found out a thing or two lately. It's somebody's birthday. The Chief Weasel's, I believe, and all the weasels will be gathered together in the dining hall, eating and drinking and laughing and carrying on, suspecting nothing. No guns, no swords, no sticks, no arms of any sort.
But the sentinels will be posted as usual.
Exactly. That is my point. The weasels will trust entirely to their sentinels, And that is where the passage comes in. That very useful tunnel leads right up under the butler's pantry, next to the dining hall.
Aha! That squeaky board in the butler's pantry. Now I understand it.
We shall creep out quietly into the butler's pantry.
With our pistols and swords and sticks.
And rush in upon them.
And whack 'em, whack 'em, whack 'em! Ha ha!
Very well, then. Our plan is settled, and there's nothing more for you to argue and squalor about. So, as it's getting very late, all of you go right off to bed at once, and we'll make all the necessary arrangements in the course of the morning.
When it began to grow dark, the rat, with an air of excitement and mystery, summoned them back into the parlor, stood each of them up alongside his little heap, and proceeded to dress them up for the coming expedition. He was very earnest and thorough-going about it, and the affair took quite a long time. First, there was a belt to go round each animal, and then a sword to be stuck into each belt, and then a cutlass on the other side to balance it. Then a pair of pistols, a policeman's truncheon, several sets of handcuffs, some bandages and sticking plaster, and a flask and a sandwich case. When all was quite ready, the Badger took a dark lantern in one paw and grasped his great stick with the other.
Now then, follow me. Rat next, Toad last. And look here, Toady, don't you chatter so much as usual, or you'll be sent back as sure as fate.
So at last they were in the secret passage, and the cutting-out expedition had really begun. It was cold and dark and damp and low and narrow, and poor Toad began to shiver, partly from dread of what might be before him, partly because he was wet through. They groped and shuffled along, with their ears pricked up and their paws on their pistols, till at last the Badger said,
We ought by now to be pretty nearly under the hall.
Then suddenly they heard, far away as it might be, and yet apparently nearly over their heads, a confused murmur of sound, as if people were shouting and cheering and stamping on the floor and hammering on tables. Toad let out a shriek of nervous terror. The passage now began to slope upwards. They groped onward a little further, and then the noise broke out again, quite distinct this time, and very close above them. They heard cheering and the stamping of little feet on the floor, and the clinking of glasses as little fists pounded on the table. They hurried along the passage till it came to a full stop, and they found themselves standing under the trap door that led up to the butler's pantry. Such a tremendous noise was going on in the banqueting hall that there was little danger of their being overheard.
And now, boys, all together!
And the four of them put their shoulders to the trap door and heaved it back. Hoisting each other up, they found themselves standing in the pantry, with only a door between them and the banqueting hall, where their unconscious enemies were carousing. The noise as they emerged from the passage was simply deafening. At last, as the cheering and hammering slowly subsided, a voice could be made out saying,
Well, I do not propose to detain you much longer. But before I resume my seat, I would like to say one word about our kind host, Mr. Toad. We all know Toad. Good Toad, modest Toad, honest Toad.
Only just let me get at him.
Hold hard a minute. Get ready, all of you.
Let me sing you a little song which I have composed on the subject of Toad. Toad he went to pleasuring gaily down the street.
The Badger drew himself up, took a firm grip of his stick with both paws, glanced round at his comrades and cried,
The hour has come. Follow me.
and flung the door open wide. What a squealing and squeaking and screeching filled the air. Well might the terrified weasels dive under the tables and spring madly up at the windows. Well might the ferrets rush wildly for the fireplace and get hopelessly jammed in the chimney. Well might the tables and chairs be upset, and glass and china be sent crashing on the floor in the panic of that terrible moment when the four heroes strode wrathfully into the room. The mighty Badger, his whiskers bristling, his great cudgel whistling through the air. Mole, black and grim, brandishing his stick and shouting his awful war cry. Rat, desperate and determined, his belt bulging with weapons of every age and every variety. Toad, frenzied with excitement and injured pride, swollen to twice his ordinary size, leaping into the air and emitting toad whoops that chilled them to the marrow. They were but four in all, but to the panic-stricken weasels the hall seemed full of monstrous animals, gray, black, brown, and yellow, whooping and flourishing enormous cudgels, and they broke and fled with the squeals of terror and dismay, this way and that, through the windows, up the chimney, anywhere to get out of reach of those terrible sticks. The affair was soon over. Up and down the whole length of the hall strode the four friends, whacking with their sticks at every head that showed itself, and in 5 minutes the room was clear. Through the broken windows, the shrieks of terrified weasels escaping across the lawn were borne faintly to their ears. On the floor lay prostrate some dozen or so of the enemy, on whom the mole was busily engaged in fitting handcuffs. The Badger, resting from his labours, leant on his stick and wiped his honest brow. The rest of the night was spent of Rat, Mole, and Badger removing the remaining occupying force from the premises and depositing them back in the wildwood. Toad, for his part, made attempts to help, but continuously found different ways to distract himself and preoccupy his attention. The following morning, Toad, who had overslept himself as usual, came down to breakfast disgracefully late, and found on the table a certain quantity of eggshells, some fragments of cold and leathery toast, a coffee-pot 3/4 empty, and really very little else, which did not tend to improve his temper, considering that, after all, it was his own house. Through the French windows of the breakfast-room, he could see the Mole and the Water-Rat sitting in wicker chairs out on the lawn, evidently telling each other stories, roaring with laughter, and kicking their short legs up in the air. The Badger, who was in the armchair and deep in the morning paper, looked up and nodded when Toad entered the room.
I'm sorry, Toad, but I'm afraid there's a heavy morning's work in front of you. You see, we really ought to have a banquet at once to celebrate this affair. It's expected of you. In fact, it's the rule.
Oh, right. Anything to oblige. I do not live to please myself, but to merely find out what my friends want, then try to arrange it for them. You dear old Badger.
The invitations will have to be written and got off at once, and you've got to write them. Now, sit down at the table. There's stacks of letter paper on it, with Toad Hall at the top in blue and gold. And write invitations to all of our friends, and if you stick to it, we shall get them out before luncheon. And I'll bear a hand, too, and take my share of the burden. I'll order the banquet.
Go, Badger. Go order the banquet. Order whatever you like. Then join our young friends outside in their innocent mirth, oblivious of me and my cares and toils. I sacrifice this morning on the altar of duty and friendship.
The Badger looked at him very suspiciously, but Toad's frank, open countenance made it difficult to suggest any unworthy motive in this change of attitude. He quitted the room accordingly, in the direction of the kitchen, and as soon as the door had closed behind him, Toad hurried to the writing table. A fine idea had occurred to him while he was talking. He would write the invitations, and he would take care to mention the leading part that he had taken in the fight, and how he had laid the chief weasel flat, and he would hint at his adventures, and what a career of triumph he had to tell about, and on the fly-leaf he would set out a sort of program of entertainment for the evening. He sketched it out in his head. The idea pleased him mightily, and he worked very hard and got all the letters finished by noon, and within an hour sent to all the neighboring recipients. At last the hour for the banquet began to draw near, and Toad, who on leaving the others had retired to his bedroom, was still sitting there, melancholy and thoughtful. His brow resting on his paw, he pondered long and deeply. His wicked schemes of own self-glorification were discovered by Badger, who then informed him there would be no song or praises of his own conceit during this banquet.
But I had such a lovely song planned out too. The toad came home. There was panic in the parlours and howling in the halls. There was crying in the cowsheds and shrieking in the stalls. When the toad came home, when the toad came home, there was smashing in of window and crashing in of door. There was shivering of weasels that fainted on the floor. When the toad came home, bang goes the drums, the trumpeters were tooting, the soldiers are saluting, and the cannons they are shooting, and the motor cars are boop-booping. As the hero comes, shout hooray, for it's the toad's great day.
Then he heaved a deep sigh, a long, long, long sigh. Then he dipped his hairbrush in the water jug, parted his hair in the middle, and plastered it down very straight and sleek on each side of his face, and unlocking the door, went quietly down the stairs to greet his guests, who he knew must be assembling in the drawing-room. All the animals cheered when he entered, and crowded round to congratulate him and say nice things about his courage and his cleverness and his fighting qualities. But Toad only smiled faintly and murmured, "Not at all," or sometimes for a change, "On the contrary." Many guests would throw their arms round Toad's neck and try to take him round the room in triumphal progress. But Toad would decline the offers.
Badger was the mastermind, and the mole and the water rat bore the brunt of the fighting, and I merely served in the ranks and did little or nothing.
The animals were evidently puzzled and taken aback by this unexpected attitude of his, and Toad felt, as he moved from one guest to the other, making his modest responses, that he was an object of absorbing interest to every one. The Badger had ordered everything of the best, and the banquet was a great success. There was much talking and laughter and chaff among the animals, but through it all Toad, who of course was in the chair, looked down his nose and murmured pleasant nothings to the animals on either side of him. At intervals he stole a glance at the Badger and Rat, and always when he looked, they were staring at each other with their mouths open, and this gave him the greatest satisfaction. Some of the younger and livelier animals, as the evening wore on, got whispering to each other that things were not so amusing as they used to be in the good old days. And there were some knockings on the table, and cries of, "Toad, speech! Speech from Toad! Song! Mr. Toad's song!" But Toad only shook his head gently, raised one paw in mild protest, and, by pressing delicacies on his guest, by topical small talk, and by earnest inquiries after members of their families not yet old enough to appear at social functions, managed to convey to them that this dinner was being run on strictly conventional lines. He confessed his immense gratitude for his 3 loyal friends, giving them all the credit. He was indeed an altered Toad.